Clint Davis, what's up, man?
What's up, dude?
How are you?
Good. Glad to be here.
Man, so you have a lot of things going on, and you have a book coming out, and let's just talk about you as an individual and how you got into what you're doing, if you don't mind starting there.
Yeah, no problem. I'm from DeVille, Louisiana, which is like outside of Pineville, outside of Alexandria, a real country town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I grew up there. My parents divorced when I was about 8, and I'm the oldest, and so I had a little sister who was younger than me, and just always felt like I needed to take care of her. And, through probably divorce, I figured out that, watching people and making sure I kind of keep things together was always kind of a skill that I learned, a survival mechanism. I found myself through high school I was a Christian, but I was real legalistic. I wasn't going to drink, I wasn't going to cuss, I wasn't going to date anybody who does. And so I just followed the rules really well, tried to be the good kid. And man, that was kind of my shtick all of high school, and really got burnt out with trying to control everything. And I didn't know what I was going to do, made bad grades, really didn't have much of an education. So I joined the military. So 2001, I joined the National Guard. I was like, well, I don't have any money. This will pay for college. I didn't make tops, and got to basic training. Second week of basic training was 9/11. And so I did that, and then Afghanistan, and then I came back, Louisiana Army National Guard, and I did the Superdome for Hurricane Katrina. And so through all that, man, I
seen some stuff. Dude.
Yeah.
And
got into drugs, alcohol, women, porn, whatever I could get into to cope with all of that stuff.
All during that time or afterwards?
Yeah, pretty much all during that time. Was trying to do college, but didn't know what I wanted to do. But through all of that, I was always the person who people would come to for advice or questions or I wasn't really in relationships, but they would be in relationships, and I would be in a season where I was doing well and they weren't. And so whether it was the military or my friends in college, it felt like people would come to me for advice. I was either the only Christian, even though I was doing a lot of the things they were doing, there was still this kind of pulse of I want to do the right thing. I'm trying to figure this thing out. And I had a meltdown in, 2003 or 4. I had a panic attack at my house. I was at my mom's, and she had to come home from work and get me, and I was laying there, and I could remember feeling the carpet. I could still feel the carpet. She had this long, shaggy carpet, and I was holding on to it like this in the middle of the living room, just freaking out. And I was like, there's a problem. So I started going to therapy.
What year is this?
2003, 2004, somewhere in there. So I come back from Afghanistan. Everybody kind of moved on. I'm trying to figure out my life. I was partying.
At that point, there wasn't a lot of information on PTSD or any types of what there is now 20 years later.
Even that long. Gosh, dating, that's a long time.
Dude, it don't seem that long ago.
That's crazy. I know you're 1980 is only 20 years ago. It's no, it's 40 years ago. So there wasn't really any trauma therapy.
Right.
I mean, the DSM didn't come out with trauma until 1984. So it's still a new thing. So I went to a Christian counselor. He was great. He was super helpful, but there was still this missing piece of well, what about trauma, and what about what's going on in my brain, and what all these things I've experienced and seen, and the church isn't really talking about it. My therapist isn't really talking about it. And so I kind of started the journey of figuring that out on my own. Got some help with therapy, stopped getting plastered every night, really tried to get my life together, got back into church, and had a really good community around me after Katrina. And that's really what changed, that connection, that community, that the people who would go, man, I love you anyway. I'm going to walk beside you. Even though you screw it up, I'm not going to judge you and criticize you. That's really the shift. And then I was like, oh, this is super helpful. I want to do this. I've already been kind of doing it on my own, just my personality. So I decided to go to grad school. I moved to California and went to Fuller Theological Seminary there, and I got a master's in marriage and family therapy. And then I came back to Louisiana. We moved to Shreveport because my wife got into a dietetic internship at the VA.
Okay.
And so we had never known anything about Shreveport. We went to Tech and lived in Ruston. And that brought us back here. And then I started working in Shreveport with the juvenile court and detention center and WARE and all these really difficult jobs, in-home therapy. And everywhere I went, I was like, why is no one talking about trauma? Why is no one talking about kind of systemic thinking? These kids are bad. These ethnicities are bad. These things are all these drug dealers, these things. And I'm like, but they all have trauma. And as a veteran, I was like, I was doing a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And left or right, I would have been doing worse things. And what helped me was, trauma therapy. And so I started really having conversations with judges and everybody I was involved with, really. And then EMDR came about. I got trained in that. I got trained as a certified sex addiction.
EMDR?
Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Okay, what is that?
So
I haven't heard of this.
It's a trauma recovery tool that uses bilateral stimulation, whether it's auditory or like an eye movement, or it can be rocking back and forth. What we found with trauma is a lot of trauma is stored in our body, and movement really helps to kind of unlock that. Somatic work, body work. And when you sleep, right, you close your eyes and you're in REM sleep, rapid eye movement, your eyes move left and right. And so Francine Shapiro found that when she was working with clients, if they would move their eyes or their bodies left and right, they would release some of those memories and those traumatic images better. And so we went and trained and got this process, and I went and did that therapy for myself, and it was super helpful. And so got trained in that, started kind of getting my feet underneath me with counseling. And then I started working with the Hub Urban Ministry, who works with human trafficking and poverty, and really just dove into that, helping women and children out of human trafficking, and that became kind of my passion, which again is trauma. And so whether it was veterans or human trafficking or sex addiction or sexual abuse, that kind of became everything that I did. And about 6 years ago, I quit everything and started Clint Davis Counseling on my own. And then that's just kind of snowballed from there.
So that's a lot, man. That's a lot.
It's the short.
That's a lot though. Like I want to go back to all that because so first off, like talking about the eye movement thing or movement in general, like, so you're a proponent of like basically that doing things outside of just sitting around and stewing on those emotions is going to release them.
100%. Yeah. I mean, you got to be strategic with it.
Right.
But even like we were just talking about jiu-jitsu, like,
well, I was going to dive in that. Yeah. Let's go into that. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Yeah. So I think as men, especially, but I think all people, movement, repetition, rhythm, working out, exercising, it releases, it lets your nervous system is what we're talking about. Right. So when you have trauma, you store the trauma in your nervous system. And so you have your front and your back, to keep it simple. You have your kind of your fetal position, which is collapse. And then you have your back, which is like standing straight up, right? And as babies in the womb, we curl in and we curl out. You see a baby, do this in the womb. And that's what actually develops the brain and develops growth. So it's crazy that like we think that just sitting and talking about something, which is good, is helpful, but it's really the movement and the connection and the relationship that helps move the body and kind of heal some things in a crazy way.
Yeah, that's I think people have talked about this, especially people suffering from PTSD and like any type of training where it's like, I'm big into CrossFit now. I used to do MMA, and I think that's how I kind of like, when you just bring yourself to the brink of feeling like you're about to die, it's like, okay, I'm not worried about those problems as much anymore. 100%. And they're not, they're not stressing my body out because I'm stressing out a different way. But I think, with the jiu-jitsu thing, it's great and it's controlled, and you can, like you really have to think and about your movements and like and everything, and it's a lot of work. And
well, I think for I was telling somebody this morning, actually, I was referring him to go, a client that I have, I'm like, you need to train, it'd be helpful. Yeah. Because I was saying, there's an element of touching, right, with fighting, with grappling, that is good for us, that we don't get enough touch in life. And that brings us back to womb and mother and connection and attachment and attunement. And a lot of us have trauma that we don't even realize is trauma just from the lack of that. And so the same things that kind of hurt us are the same things that heal us. And so it's interesting that with jiu-jitsu, like as guys, sometimes we're real homophobic about stuff and we joke around. But like, the first time you roll with somebody, you got to get on top of them and mount. It's like you feel kind of weird because you've never done that. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, you're 6 months in, you don't even think about it. You're grinding your hips as hard as you can to stay in mount. And we've over-sexualized things and traumatized things so much that we made everything so like weird and erotic, and then you get back down to the basics, and it's like, well, that's actually the thing that heals you in an appropriate way.
Well, do you think, how do you think trauma is associated? Like, I know everyone deals with it different, and everyone has different trauma, but do you think there's like a blanket approach to treating it? No. So it's all individualized?
I think so. I think that's one of the biggest problems we've got into with the culture is...
that's what everyone will put an opinion out, and everyone just thinks that's going to work for them, right?
Yeah. Anybody that says this is the only way to treat is a problem to me. Okay. So like everybody I see in our practice does a little bit of different stuff. Like I just hired a new lady to do brain spotting. So brain spotting is a way that you store trauma in your body, and what you do is you get a person to kind of hold that tension, that emotion, and what happens is you'll find people looking, like I'm looking up right now, and they'll find a certain spot that they'll feel that emotion in their body, and you have them hold that spot and kind of process. It's really cool.
How do you find that though? Like, how do you know, like, if you're a person dealing with, I'm just trying to think of, put myself in that mindset, because I've dealt with probably past trauma, but it's not something that lurks on me, or, I'm sure everybody does, but it's not something I'm ever thinking about really at all, and it doesn't really come up. So how do you pinpoint something to treat it?
Well, I don't think you need to go in and deal with stuff unless it's causing dysfunction.
That's like, people are talking about DMT and ayahuasca. I'm like, dude, I'm afraid to do that because I don't want to open any doors that are closed.
No, bro, I'm not totally against people trying stuff like that.
Yeah.
I'm not totally against much, but if you're in a severe situation and nothing else is working, but I think we're getting to a place where people just want an excuse to try stuff and get some kind of experience. And I think we're all looking for connection and eye-opening revelations, and yet those things are risking a lot more than they're doing any help for most people if it's not real contained. And so I think there's a lot of options. I think we've, to some degree, because my definition for trauma is anything that's not nurturing.
Okay.
So
but that's subjective, right?
Sure.
If you say that to someone, they're going to take it one way, or someone else is going to take it another way.
Exactly. So we call that like a no crap line. Okay. So like what happens is I say, well, anything, trauma is anything that's not nurturing. And you got the guy who's like, well, everybody, it's like, well, no crap. But the reality is, right? The reality is that we as human beings, we have not developed claws and fangs over thousands of years. We have not evolved into violent creatures. We don't. That's not what we're wired to do. We're wired to build community, to bring each other together. And anytime we're divisive, it's tribalism. We tribe up and then we fight.
Right.
So LSU versus Alabama, it's silly, but that's tribalism. The more you get in a gang, the more those gangs are going to fight. It's not better for society. And so over the course of thousands of years, we can look and go, okay, we're not meant to murder each other. That's not a good thing. We're not meant to harm each other. We have been developed into these things. So when there's abuse, when there's somebody being mean to you, when there's somebody talking trash to you, when somebody flips you off, all of that is traumatic. It changes the way you think. It changes the way your brain functions. It changes the way you think the world is safe and relationships are safe and God is safe. The level of trauma is what we have to decide, because I got in a car wreck like 7 years ago. Mm-hmm. A lady ran a red light, hit me head on. I had the airbag hit me really hard. I had a seatbelt burn. I never thought about that car wreck again. Like, I didn't have a problem driving. I didn't have a problem functioning. I didn't think about it never bothered me. I don't know why that is, right? There's some level of resiliency in me around that issue that just wasn't really that big of a deal. I see clients all the time who get in fender benders, or who get kind of swung around, and I have to work with them through EMDR because they cannot drive.
It's one of those things though, right? It's like the hardest thing you ever dealt with is the hardest thing you ever dealt with. Mm-hmm. And then how you deal with things just varies on the type of person you are and what adversity you've dealt with, right?
Right. Yeah. Afghanistan to a car wreck. Not that big of a deal.
I feel like I've seen stuff in my life and I'm like, this doesn't bother me. You know what I mean? Like, where it's bothering someone else. And that's when you talk about tribalism, I always think about this because I feel like I do think that we are meant to, and this is my opinion, and I'm definitely not versed like you are, but sure. I just from looking at everything, I don't think we're meant to have access to so many people.
We're not.
I think that's an issue. I do think that, yes, it's not great that we segregate and we fight, but that's what we inherently do from human nature.
Yep.
And I do think that when we're all masses come together and we're able to talk, horrible to someone on a different continent within a millisecond, and I just feel like it's just there's something not good about being so interconnected.
Absolutely, I think you're 100% right. We there's a really good book. Oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the name of it, but it's about evolutionary psychology, and again, evolution doesn't mean like we came from monkeys. So that's a big thing that people have a hard time with, especially Christians.
We've evolved. If you look at the size of people 50 years ago with the size of us now, that's evolution.
Exactly.
You don't have to get into the argument of Homo sapiens and and all that,
but people do, because it's just like everything, it's the no crap line. They're like, wait a second, and it's like, dude, just chill out. But we haven't evolved enough to deal with technology. So imagine this book is a raft, right? And there's the generation behind you, right? They're on this edge, and they have to jump to the raft. Well, then the book, right? When you build a technology like fire, it pushes the raft a little bit. Mm-hmm. So the next group jumps, and it's a little farther from the jump. Well, when the smartphone came out and the internet came out, really, it pushed the raft too far. So we didn't evolve quick enough to be able to keep up with the thing that we're now like living on and banking
I think
on.
that's a very good perspective, and I haven't had anyone talk about it like that. I'm glad you said that, because I do think that's a good perspective, because in conversation, me just talking about these things, inherently, like, these are tools we use, and I'm going to continue to use them, and I'm not bad mouthing them, but there's a lot of issue, and it's because of that. It's because it's just before our time, and we're just now learning how to do it. And fortunate, and also I think it's also great that you and I are the generation that is experienced no internet and internet. I think that's something that we could talk about the rest of our lives.
Absolutely.
Whereas the people who are born into this don't know anything different, and that's why they're latching onto it and it doing good things with it and a lot of bad things with it.
100%. Yeah, it's in the book. There's a chapter called "Digital Analog to Digital Converts versus Digital Natives." So that's what we're dealing with. We're converts. Like, remember when your math teacher said you're not going to have a calculator everywhere you go?
Yeah, we do.
But no kid under 27 has heard that in their life.
No.
Like, no person under 30 has ever heard a teacher say you're not going to have a calculator everywhere you go.
Well, we didn't even use computers.
Right.
We had a typing class. I think I had one class like in high school, but we weren't even surfing the internet. We're just typing Word documents and stuff. You know? So, like, the fact that every single thing that they do in a classroom is built around that. And, you know, it is interesting, because I think here's another thing that I think about too, is that, yes, it's been pushed so far ahead of us, and yes, we've been dealing with the transition, but also we don't know how to coach them through, and we don't know how to show them the way, because we remember before and we remember after, and this is something that just exists for them.
Yeah, we don't know what the red flags are.
Right.
Because we didn't
until it's too
late.
It.
Yeah.
Right.
And yes, and it is too late. I mean, the self-harm rate has increased since 2010, 176%. I'm sorry, 200%. And the suicide rate has increased 176% in teens.
And it's just all because of,
well, I would
access
say,
to information
2010 is when Instagram came out and cell phones got in the hands of the majority of teenagers. So 2007, the first iPhone came out. 2008, the second one came out. And when our second iPhone came out, we handed our first one to our kid.
When did you have your first cell phone that you could
10 years ago.
That you could browse the internet with?
10 years ago. My wife just sent me a thing, and it said, it was like a Facebook thing. It was like, her post was like, I think I'm going to give in and finally get a smartphone. And that was like 10 years ago. And we both got one.
I think I had a cell phone in high school, but it was one of those things where we didn't even text yet.
Yeah, you mean smartphone, right?
Yeah, I'm talking about smartphone. Yeah, yeah. I even had a smartphone, but we weren't using it to its capabilities because we didn't even know what it would do.
Right.
And I don't think it was probably till 2008 that I really had one in my hand, you know, and started using it. And that seems like forever to go if you talk to a teenager, but for us,
less than 15 years.
It's not that long ago.
So if we look at, like, that's the thing that people don't realize is, like, people our age and older still think they live in that world.
They do.
And we don't. And even us, like, we forget. Like, the other day, somebody's in my office, and I was like, they were like, hey, I need to get your number. And so I went to my desk, and I tore off a piece of paper and wrote it down. And I turned around and handed it to them, and they had their phone out looking at me like, you idiot. Like, what are you doing?
I do.
But it's like, that's what we did for 30 years.
Yeah. I do see some romanticism in that. Like, I like it. I like the idea of still, like, writing notes down and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I am one of the persons that I'll pull out and put notes in my phone because it's easier and more efficient. But for the longest time when I was especially working in oil and gas, I had a calendar and I would just jot things down every day. And I still know a lot of people that do that. But, like,
it's
everything,
still uncomfortable in my brain.
Yeah, it's just, I do think I don't think, and it's probably because we haven't had enough time, but, like, and you may know this, like, we're the studies on, like, where we're sitting and how we're dealing with that and the transformation between not having it and having it. Is there any of that information, or have you looked at it?
Not much, yeah. Well, there's a reason that is, and that's the agenda of the powers that be.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, what came out in the congressional hearings, 2 years ago or last year, I can't remember when it was that Facebook and Instagram actually knew that it was causing anxiety in teens. And they showed that at the congressional meeting, that they did do tests to see how it was working.
Is this when they had them on trial for all the other stuff?
Yep.
Okay.
And they showed that, like, they knew that there was some anxiety and some, you know, depression that came with social media, and they did it anyway.
Yeah.
But they didn't, you know, The thing about the phone, I think that, and when I say phone, I mean smart device. So parents need to realize, like, if their kid has a tablet, they have a phone.
Yeah.
Right. So kids aren't getting in trouble for calling people.
No,
right. Like
they're not. No one's calling anyone.
They're getting in trouble for apps, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat. Predators on all of those things. Porn being sent to them on all of those things.
Yeah, man, that's another thing. Like, we didn't have access to those things.
No, dude.
You had to look hard for it when you were like 13.
If you're at a camp out, maybe somebody had a magazine that had some, a naked woman in it. And what's crazy, man, is that is the origin, right? If you did like a bad guy story, right, a villain story, and you're like, okay, well, what's the origin of the problem? If we look at today, and we look at like all the porn, all the trafficking, all the sexualization, all the abuse, all the unhealthy versions of sexuality in our country, which is one of the main problems we have, because we just dehumanize everybody about everything. Our kids are getting exposed to earlier. The sexual abuse rates are higher. The porn rates are higher. All those things. If we go, okay, there's people, human beings who are creating that culture. Who are they? Well, they're 50 to 60-year-old men, right, who own businesses, who own companies, who create those things.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Right? Because there's not 14-year-olds creating porn, right? They don't own Pornhub. They don't own strip clubs. They don't own prostitution rings. Those are men who own those things for the majority. Why did they become that way? So we trace back 40 years and go, well, 40 years ago they looked at a magazine somewhere. They got sexually abused. They were exposed to men who, looked at women a certain way. And then that trauma grew in them into this thing.
What do you think?
So if that's the origin of the current situation, now let's look at a 12-year-old today and see what they're being exposed to. Well, they're looking at porn all day. They're looking at graphic violence, right? They're masturbating to graphic violence. They are having sex and acting out in all kinds of ways that nobody even knew about or was capable of thinking about 40 years ago. What will they create in another 30 years? Because we're doing nothing about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's the terrifying part of where we're going as a society.
Yeah, I mean, it's just we're detached from it. We're not. That's the problem. We're detached from it because we're not living in it and we can't relate to them.
Nope.
Because do you think there's another issue with like growing, like we've like, just like I said before, we were on the side before, we're on the side after it. But we don't. I feel like our age demographic of people don't succumb to it like they do because they have access. I don't know. It's weird, right? Are we more sensitive to that?
I think they're more susceptible to it because they're less resilient. I think
right.
they've been
okay. Yeah. Because
their brain has been captivated by dopamine since they were 3.
Yeah, but all right. What's your opinion? You specialize in this.
Yeah.
So my kids, and I'll say this, like biologically, they are not mine. I adopted them this past year. I've been in their lives for the past 3 years. Their father's deceased, so I am their dad. I see it that way. My kids don't have TVs in their bedroom. We watch TV as a family. Do I let them watch some stuff they probably shouldn't? Yeah, but I'm there with them and I kind of monitor it. I don't want them sheltered from the world, They do not have phones. They're 8 and 9. They do not have access to YouTube. They when I first came into their lives, they had access to YouTube and they were watching it all the time, and they weren't really watching anything bad. But I just feel like like you said, the dopamine and having access to that, and the parents putting tablets in kids' hands because they don't want to deal with them.
Babysitters.
Yeah, at dinner. Like, what's your opinion, professional and like personal opinion on how we're using? Like, we want to. That's my biggest issue with everything is that everyone wants to complain about something, but everyone's a part of the problem, and they don't want to do anything about it.
Culture is made up of people.
Yeah, and it's too late. And it's like, well, they're bitching about. Excuse my language. They're bitching about this, and that, but they're part of the problem. And I mean, I'm sure we all are. But like, I'm combating it, and I'm on the same note. I don't want them to jump into a world where this is here and they don't know how to deal with it and be overwhelming. So I feel like I'm slowly introducing them to technology, but I feel like at a hopefully a safe rate. I don't really know what that is because the landscape's hasn't been laid out in front of me. There's no blueprint for this. Yep. I'm just like, okay, well, this is how I was introduced to technology. It was video games and a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and then eBay, and then Zynga and whatever, MySpace. Yeah, AIM. Yeah, and like, in some games. So I'm like, okay, well, if I'll just slowly introduce them, maybe it won't be so much of a slap in your face, because I mean, just like the teenage girl who's locked up her whole life and then she gets let loose to college and goes crazy. I know that's a stereotype, but I'm just saying that's in my mind. Like, well, look how that turns out sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I mean, that's really what the book is about.
Okay, cool.
I mean, I'll talk about it, but that is why it's called a guidebook, because it's a conversation about how we got here, where we are, and where we're going, and then what to do. I mean, it's very, very broken down chapter by chapter so that people get the totality of not just, hey, do this with your phones, but why and where we're coming from. And that was really my goal with the book. And well, let's think about it this way. So my oldest is almost 9, and about 3 years ago, I bought him a straight up Nintendo, like the old school Nintendo. Okay. Yeah. He, if you remember playing Ninja Turtles on that thing?
Yeah, man.
Dude,
you do the flips and stuff.
Yep.
Yeah.
So 15 minutes in, he throws the controller down and goes, I'm going outside to jump at the trampoline. Mad because he lost like 30 times in the first sewer.
Dude, I don't think I ever beat that thing.
Right. It was so difficult, right?
Yes.
So what happens when you have resistance and you have to fail and build that is that you release serotonin mainly. You get a little dopamine, but mostly serotonin, which builds resiliency in you because you have to defer your reward. You have to learn to earn it and pick up on it, right? So when we played Zelda and it took 6 months to finally beat it, and you're like, right, what a relief when you finally beat it. That's the difference in a game today where, and there are hard games. I'm not saying there are easy ones, but the large majority of them, any kid can pick the controller up and they have continues and they have infinity lives and they go through the game and they beat it in 3 or 4 days. It's the highest level of beauty and adrenaline and fun and control, but there's no resistance. There's no difficulty. And so that's what leads to addiction.
And there's you can find cheat codes. I remember when GTA came out, we were playing that. You could find a cheat code over this and that. Then it takes away the fun of the game, in my opinion.
You remember Game Shark back in the day, the thing that you hooked up to and you plugged it in?
Yeah, and you could get all the cheat codes and
exactly.
stuff. Yeah.
So that's part of what people have to understand is we can't think about, oh, well, I played Nintendo games and I was never addicted. The Nintendo games are not the same. Oh, I saw magazines and I was never addicted. The magazines are not the same. Mm-hmm. The things that our kids are being exposed to are far different than the things that we were exposed to. And there's a big difference in exposure and immersion. So we were exposed. The human heart's always been the human heart, right? All of these things that we deal with have always been dealt with. The problem is that people were just exposed to those things periodically. These kids are immersed in it. They live in it. It's every day. You think about anything, violence, drugs, language, sex, any of those things. We all get exposed to it. We don't want to keep our kid in in a bubble, right? Just being in life, they're going to be exposed to things.
Yeah.
So when we expose them to things or they get exposed to things, then we educate and equip, and I would say disciple them through it. Walk them through it, teach them through it. Go, okay, hey, that language is how people talk, but we want to be careful with that language in certain perspectives or in certain times. We want to watch how drinking, okay, you can have a glass of wine, you might be able to do this thing, but look, these people are getting wasted and abusing alcohol, right? We don't want to hide them from all of it, and then at 18, but people's response is, well, I don't want to hide them from all of it, so I'll just drink around them and let them do, right? It's these pendulums that we swing on.
Yeah.
And it's in the middle where health is going to be found to some degree.
Well, I think, because I think every single individual family and household is different. Mm-hmm. But I do think exposure is a big issue. The only education I have on you is the short TED Talk I watched. I watched enough to, a friend of mine sent it to me. I watched enough to say, okay, I'm definitely interested to talk to this guy.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the conversation of sex when we're younger, and that it should be talked about, but sometimes everyone avoids it. Mm-hmm. But then you get access to all these other things. I think that's what it was in a nutshell. I don't remember the specifics,
that's right.
But I do think that's important because that's not something no one talked to me about it.
Yeah. So the term that I coined is called childhood sexual neglect. So if you remember in the talk, I talk about teaching your kid how to cross the street, right?
Right.
Every kid's going to cross the street. There's going to be streets. There's going to be sidewalks. There's going to be vehicles. You have to teach them this stuff or they're going to die. Every kid is going to have a sexual developmental stage, right? They're going to hit puberty. They're going to masturbate. They're going to have a period. They're going to be around other children who are sexually developed. But what we've done as an entire society is we've omitted that conversation. And so thousands, millions of children, most people that I talk to, their parent never talked to them about how their body was going to change. They never talked to them about consent or body safety or what to do if they see a naked photo or a naked image or any of those things. And so that means that every one of those people was neglected because they have seen those things. They have been exposed to those things. They have experienced those things without a guide, without a knowledge, without a truth, without a compass. And my job isn't to tell people what that morality is. My job is to say, you have to teach your kid a morality around it. The idea that you can not talk to your kids about these things is as neglectful as not teaching them to cross the street, because they're going to walk out in the road and get hit by a car, and then they're going to go, Mom, Dad, why didn't you tell me cars existed?
Yeah.
Right? And so when we have our first, let's say, nocturnal emission as a boy, right? You have your first wet dream is what they call it. You wake up in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden you're like, what is happening to me? Am I dying? Like, what's going on? And this feels good, right? Well, you don't go talk to your parents because your parents didn't talk to you about it.
Yeah, and you don't know what's going on. You're embarrassed. You talk to your friends.
Shame.
Yeah.
Right? So your first link to sexual development, a totally natural, normal sexual thing, is to feel shame about it.
Yeah.
And hide it, and then go joke with your friends or Google it now. And, I mean, all the information you get about that's going to be atrocious. And so your origin story of sexuality it's all that. Shame, fear, surprise. That's millions of people. So when I go to talks, I did it at the TED Talk, but I speak in front of 2,000 or 3,000 people sometimes, and I'll say, listen, if you don't believe what I'm saying, raise your hand if your parent talked to you about masturbation. I love to do this at churches because it really.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I did it last week.
It's
there were 400 people in the room.
Yeah.
I've never had more than 3 people raise their hand.
And there's probably some people that were embarrassed, but still not a lot.
Sure.
There's still not, because there's not.
But it's consistent. Like over time, over 200, 300 talks, I've never had more than 2. So yeah, there's probably a few people out there, but generally we're going 90% of people did not have this conversation.
So if they didn't have the conversation and they didn't have the access, now we're not having the conversation with our children and they have the access, imagine what can happen.
Boom. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
So when you ask, like, why are kids so suicidal? Why are they so depressed? Why are they so anxious? Well, if you're 10-year-old, if 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys has experienced sexual abuse by 18, that's the stat. And that's what's reported. And that's, 4 years old.
And, because we have cases that are reported 30 years later that no one ever wanted to admit to. Now,
Yes, absolutely. So if that's the case, they've been neglected sexually by their parents, not intentionally, and this is not to hate on parents. They didn't know because they weren't taught, but it's the reality of the research. So they've been neglected. They've been exposed to porn. They've had sleepovers where somebody's touched them or somebody's, acted out with them. And maybe it wasn't abuse, but maybe it was another kid who saw something or had something happen and they, explore. Then that's before puberty. Right. And then puberty hits and they form what's called an arousal template. So all of us have that. It's why we like breasts or why we like butts or why we like blondes. It's this innate connection to our emotions and our history and what we've been exposed to. And puberty and hormones wire, and we start to like things that make us feel good, that turn us on. And that's how that's supposed to naturally be formed. But if all of this stuff has happened before, there's never been any recovery. No one's ever sat that kid down and said, hey, these things shouldn't have happened. This is not abnormal. These things are not healthy. Then how dysfunctional does that get with wiring and with psychology and with, arousal? Mm-hmm. And then you lead into pornography and into sex with teenagers and all the things that we know happen in culture. And we wonder why people are very confused and shame-based and nobody knows what the heck is going on.
Yeah. And is this something that you've just heard?
I'm extremely particular when it comes to my vehicles, and I only recommend those who are the same way. That's why I always recommend SBC Autos. They take pride in their inventory, from badass four-wheel drives, clean classic cars, and even your everyday grocery getters. They have it all. No hassle, no BS. SBCautos.com.
Heard so much and seen so much on a daily basis. You were like, I need to write a book about this.
Well, it's part of my own story. I mean, I had sexual trauma with a person when I was 11. Same kind of story. My parents just never told me anything. And I remember growing up and wrestling and sleeping over. And it went from like totally normal to not thinking about anything to staying up and watching Cinemax to wrestling in the pool to being like, why does this feel good? But between 10 and 12, you don't really think erotically.
No, yeah.
Nowadays people do. Here's the problem. When we grew up, we weren't exposed to all this stuff, so there wasn't really anything in your main to think about it.
Yeah.
But now you've got 8-year-olds with iPads, right? By 11, research shows that the average kid has watched 20 hours of pornography.
Holy shit, man.
By 11. So if that's the case, right, and you haven't even hit puberty, right, you're not even having the natural, like, instincts. And I think that's what's so confusing for people to say, well, my 6-year-old is this way, or my 5-year-old is this way, or my 9-year-old feels this way. It's like, Well, none of us are talking about what's happened and what they've been exposed to and what the culture is exposing them to. We're just assuming that this is organic, that these things are just coming out this way. And there's so much shame around having these conversations that, through my training as a CSAT and a sex addiction therapist and working with people, my own story, countless conversations with pastors and churches. And, you start to talk about this and people are like, oh, me too. Like that happened to me. Oh, I didn't know that was traumatic. Like I thought that just happened. It's like, people say, well, boys watch porn. I'm like, well, statistically, yeah, most boys watch porn. Are we saying that's good because most of them do that? We normalize unhealth. We're like, because it's normal, it's healthy. And it's like, no. Normal in our society is extremely toxic.
It used to be normal to smoke a pack of cigarettes a day 50 years ago.
Yeah,
too. You know
exactly.
what I mean? Doesn't mean it was healthy.
Absolutely. So that's where the book kind of came from, is me getting really frustrated with having these conversations with clients at churches, with speaking events, and people emailing me in droves afterwards going, how did you know my childhood? How did you know my life? Oh my gosh, that was so helpful. And then 6 months later, I implemented these things and it changed our culture. It changed our family. I left your talk at so-and-so school. I went and checked my kid out, and I got his phone out of his locker, and he had so much porn and so many nude pictures, and I never knew that I was even supposed to do it. 87% of parents have no rules for devices.
You would think, I believe that. On the same token, you would think that this is being talked about so much that
recently,
what's going on? Yeah, recently.
So we're a decade into this being a problem.
So it's been happening a while.
Yes.
So since we're talking about this, let's talk about what's your advice to, because there's going to be especially the demographic listening to this podcast, a lot of people our age, what's your advice to them about having this conversation, and what age do you all the things you probably get asked, like let's just run through these FAQs.
Yeah. So we got to think about a couple of things. One is, the reason it's called Building Better Bridges is because you want to build a bridge between you and your child that can hold heavy things. And you want that in your marriage. You want that in your friendships. You can't have a new friend and then just drop some bomb on them and expect it to hold, right? Just like with your child, you can't, like most of our parents did, wait until 14 and then be like, son, let me sit you down and tell you about sex. Wear a condom, don't get her pregnant, moving on. Like, if that's the hand raised, like, oh, I had a sex talk, that's not what we're talking about, right?
I didn't even have that, man. I don't think I had anything. I had a single mom and dad. I love my dad. We have a good relationship now, but back then he just wasn't around a lot because he was working,
Of course.
And so, like, I don't think I ever had a conversation at all about anything. I just figured it out with friends and whatever,
Yeah, trial and error.
I don't know.
Doesn't go well.
I don't even remember, but it's just like that has to be, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when people hear me talk about neglect, right? The neglect part is not equipping and educating our kids on things that they're already going through, right? It's not like telling them things that they shouldn't know or exposing them to things that they shouldn't know. That's we're doing. The other swing, right, is like drag shows in libraries and over sexualizing.
I was going to get to that too, man.
Yeah. So, but that's a swing of sterilizing sex and making sex this religious conservative thing that we shouldn't ever talk about, all the way over to let's overly expose them to everything.
That's just, hey, we have a narrative over here. Let's see how far we can push it.
100%. And I think in some ways, obviously, there's some real toxicity in there. But I think it is an attempt in some ways to educate and equip and not shame kids around sexuality. It's just missing the mark.
It's just it's a different way of going about it.
Yes. But so with me, what I would say is you have to, one, and it's in the book too, is know about your kids' sexual and just emotional developmental stages. So as a parent, right, you get a new truck, you get a new phone, you get a computer, you get whatever. What do? We research and we look into it and we go, how's this thing function? How's this thing work? I want to know everything front and back because I paid $2,000 for this thing and I want it to run smoothly, right? Mm-hmm. But somehow we don't do that with our children. We're like, well, my parents had kids, or this other person had kids, and so I'm going to parent how they did, or I'm going to do the opposite of how they did, and let's see how that goes. And our parents would say, well, there weren't books on this stuff. Well, there are now.
Yeah.
We have the brain research, we have the literature, we have the podcast, we have all this stuff to say, you're not going to be a perfect parent, but here's how you can parent pretty well, and you can love on your kid and discipline your kid in a way that's not abusive and not traumatic. Life's hard enough without adding to it. So I would say there hasn't been a really good book on how to have these conversations, which is why none of us know it. And so there's a bunch of Like, let's take masturbation. So masturbation is something that pretty much everybody feels uncomfortable with talking about. Even using the word, especially in like a church, is going to freak people out. But the reality is 98% of human beings have done it, will do it, normal part of development. When you do it with pornography, when you do it thinking about an old relationship and you're married, when you do it out of a habit, out of coping that becomes controlling and shaming, that's when it's a really big problem. So if we don't talk about it, then it's only going to go to toxic levels. So you wouldn't talk to your 3-year-old about masturbation, right? They're not even remotely to that stage. What you might talk to your 3 or 4-year-old is about, hey, that's your penis. Your proper terms for private parts are your penis. Like, I have 2 boys, so we have the penis rules. It's like, who can touch it, who can see them naked, who can wash them, and when and where that's appropriate, right? Very simple. And we go over that. We read through that in a book. We talk through that. So my kids can easily spout off like who can touch them and who can't. And you heard that at the beginning of the TED Talk, right? My mom kicked my son out of the bathroom because he was like, hey, you can't see my penis, Nana, get out.
Yeah.
And she's like, what? And so she came, like, what's wrong? I'm safe. And I'm like, that's not the point. The point, you're safe.
He knows his boundaries.
But if he's in a bathroom at 10 and some dude's looking over the stall, he knows to be like, hey, don't do that.
Yeah.
I didn't know to not do that, right? In the moment, if something like that happens, you freeze or you go, well, is this what happens? Like, is this what's supposed to happen? And then now that's your fault and you feel shame for years. And all this mess starts. So with my kids, for example, and with clients and people I've worked through, like, you go, hey, you know, I always tell a story, but my oldest is in the bathtub and he's swimming in the bathtub naked and he's rubbing his stomach and penis on the porcelain. Well, he stands up and he's like, my penis hurts. And I'm like, yeah, buddy, what were you doing? He's like, well, I was rubbing it on the tub. And I said, okay, well, that's called an erection. I was like, there's blood in your penis. And, you know, just give it a second. Our penis is for TTing. Don't do that.
Yeah.
And we moved on.
Yeah.
We've had that conversation 3 or 4 times in various different ways. Don't make it weird. Don't go on and on about it. But he just knows that's what happens. Well, in the next couple of years, 'cause he's about to be 9, he's going to start moving into what is sex and how are babies made. And we'll start to have that conversation. Hey, remember your penis does this? Well, that's for these reasons. In my opinion, God wired you this way. You're going to want to make a baby. This is what happens. And the bridge is, for 9 years, he's used to me having these kind of nonchalant, you know, conversations that are important, but that make his body normal and not taboo and not weird. So when I'm going to have this other gentle conversation, it's not a switch. It's not, my dad's never talked to me about this, and now he's sitting me down to have this weird sex talk.
Yeah.
Right?
That you want to get over immediately.
Yes, exactly. And I'm not waiting until he's 14 where he has 3 years of his own experience with it. And now dad wants to have this conversation where I'm embarrassed, I have shame, I have memories, I have experiences that while you're talking to me, I'm thinking about all those things, right? And so you want to try to have any of these talks developmentally right before the stage, right? So as you see it or as it's developing, you go, okay, now's the time. They're about to hit puberty. My kids call it daddy hair on their legs. You know, they're starting to grow and they're going, why is this? What is this? Just give them a very simple conversation, read a book with them, tell them about it. Say, hey, I'm open to any questions you have. You can come to me and have this conversation. I'm not going to make you feel weird. I'm not going to shame you. And then that develops into teen years where they have their first kiss, they have sex, they make some mistake. Like, you've already kind of preset them to go, my dad, my mom is a person safe that I can go to. Also, here's your Uncle CJ, here's Uncle DJ, here's my friends who you can also ask about, who are safe people. So if you feel uncomfortable with me, because you're my son,
right? Yeah.
Know that you can go to him. He's going to have the same answer that I do, which means you have to have a community of people who are on the same page.
And you have to feel comfortable developing that community.
Yes. So a lot of it revolves around this the problem revolves around this individualized, isolated culture that we live in, where this has become such a problem because we're siloed up by ourselves trying to raise kids. We're so worried about the wrong things.
Do you think that as humans that sometimes we're too attached to these, we attach too much emotions to these physical things that may create issues?
Yeah.
Like where it's going to bring on shame or excitement or whatever. But at the same time, if we just looked at it as a physical act, would we view everything different? And then also, at what point is like too far? Like, you don't want to let your kids, like, you don't want to be comfortable with them doing things you know about it and say, okay, at some point this is going to change your life, whether it be you put yourself in a situation to where you may become sexually abused because you were just in the space and you put yourself out there, or you get someone pregnant, or you become pregnant too early and you don't know how to deal with it. Like, where do we draw the line at all these things, and how do we dictate, okay, what's too far and what's, I mean, how does it swing?
I think being in community is important. Like having a therapist or a professional or a pastor or a rabbi or somebody who's in your life who guides you is super vital, because you have to be able to say, hey, here's what we're struggling with. Help me in this scenario, right? So every kid's different. I would never say, this is what you should do with every child. Mm-hmm. I would say, know your kid's personality, know what they like, know their strengths, their weaknesses, and then figure out how to educate them and equip them and walk alongside them as they grow. Not every kid's the same. And so your sister might need something than the brother. The two brothers might need something different. But I think within the scope of like how much is too much, if you wait, so we have two issues. We have recovery and we have prevention. Mm-hmm. The book covers both. One of the problems, like you talked about, is like we're 10 years into this. So if you're listening to this and you have a 16-year-old or you have a 14-year-old.
They've already been through a lot of this stuff, and they just didn't, if you don't have the relationship, you didn't even know this.
Right.
Yeah.
And no one's taught you, so it's not your fault. I don't want you to panic and feel like ashamed as a parent, going, oh my gosh, I've screwed this up royally. There is hope, there's redemption, there's recovery, but that's what you got to do. You got to recover. You got to start having those conversations, and hopefully by 22, 23, that kid calls you and goes, hey, thanks for helping me those years. Sorry, I was such a pain in the butt. But the prevention arm is what I'm really hopeful for, is that the people with like 10 and under kids, 12 and under kids can really change the course correct and change where they're going. And we as a society can do some things drastically different than what we've done for the last 10 or 12 years. It's going to have to be drastic because none of it's beneficial. I mean, there are parts of being able to exchange information that's beneficial, but Facebook, social media, Instagram, all these things, we feel connected, but we're the most disconnected, isolated culture of all time.
Yeah. How often do you see that someone gets together and have a conversation like we're having? Like,
very
I think that's why what we do right here is successful, and I've continued to do it because I have good feedback, because no one just seems to make the time for themselves to sit down and have that conversation about whatever that subject may be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we need to fall back to, but I don't know if we are, because, I mean, the access to information, like, we can almost tell ourselves what we want to know. Like, we can pretty much manipulate the answer to any question we have and make ourselves feel like, okay, this is the answer. Not only is this the right answer, but it's the answer I wanted, even though it may not be technically the right answer. But there's so much information out there that there's a viewpoint that says it's right. Mm-hmm. And you may just run with that, and that gives you all the power in the world to push your thought or your agenda or whatever. And then you just get enough people around you, then like that's where we have issues, because I don't know, man. It's like we're trying to solve the world's problems. We're never going to figure it out, but maybe just one little piece at a time. You know what I mean?
I do. I mean, it's the echo chamber problem, right? You have the phone literally doing it.
Yeah.
So the algorithm is literally only sending you stuff that it knows you're going to click on and that you like.
It's a marketing tool. That's what it's for.
100%. But then we, because of social media, we've become the thing that social media is.
Yeah.
We have adopted that for 10 years of like, well, this feels good. It feels good to be seen. It feels good to be heard. It feels good to be validated.
It feels good to be right.
Right.
Even though you may not be, but you have enough people telling you that you are, because they need some type of following or something to follow.
Yep. Well, right is the fake version of connection.
Yeah.
So we haven't had enough intimacy and connection with our race and our parents. And, we could go into a long talk about war and how that's affected everybody. But, we really want connection. And it's these things like being right have become the fake connection. It's like, well, I just want to be right. And that's validation. It's like, well, validation and being right are not the same things. I can validate you as a human being and say your worth and your value is still intrinsic, and you have so much worth and value to me, but your behavior is unhealthy and harming you. And we think that's judgmental. And it's like, judgmental is me saying, because you smoke or drink or have tattoos, I think less of you.
Yeah.
Right? No, I'm saying you smoke a pack a day. Have you thought about how that affects your body and your mind and your brain? I love you. I think you're amazing.
That's just me giving, the feedback based on information that is inherently known by everyone in studies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we take that because we're so fragile. We're so offendable. We take any kind of pushback or disagreement as, I think your worth and value is less. And I think that's really one of the major psychological problems of our culture. And if we go into how are we building that in our kids, well, my goodness, we've swung over into we got to validate everything you believe and think, or you're going to kill yourself. And that doesn't matter if you're trans or straight or And so we got to find that tension of like getting our kids outside, making them do their work, making them, help with chores, making them do things that are difficult so they build some resiliency, and then helping them educating them to understand their emotions so that when a bully at school says something to them or somebody disagrees with their political standing, they don't implode and fall apart.
Why the hell does the kid have a political standing?
Right. Well, because they're sitting in their living room with their parent.
Right. That is a problem. That's what I'm saying. Why? Because I'll hear the kids will be at the grandparents and they'll come home and say something. I'm like, oh shit, they watching Fox News all weekend. Right. I don't want to hear this shit. Like,
that's right.
Are you kidding me,
100%.
man? But it starts there. I mean, look what Hitler did. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I mean, he was a well-respected college professor, and he literally had the power to manipulate that many people to change the course of the entire world.
Yeah, he's charismatic.
Yeah,
people want to connect. They wanted to feel a part.
He was intelligent, charismatic. He just swayed opinions.
Yeah, I mean, but it's the human condition, man. I mean, just theologically, you look at kind of the story of Adam and Eve, and you go, okay, they're in this perfect place. God's there. They've done nothing wrong. They've got it all set up. And there's this kind of story where, Adam and Eve they've got this perfect place. And he says, don't eat from this tree, right? Like, you don't need to know what I know. You can't handle it.
Yeah.
Like, if you know what I know, it's going to be problematic. Mm-hmm. And they have everything in front of them they need, but their fear of missing out and their desire to be like God, they go and eat from this thing. And the problem is not only did they have it, but they have this serpent that's chirping in their ear saying, yeah, you're not going to die.
Yeah.
Like God, maybe you can't trust God. Maybe his plan's not good for you. And if we look at everything, it's like that is the human condition. I want to be God. Like, I know what's right. And yet I'm like, and I know statistically and research, I know in marriage when I tell people all day, like, go do this with your wife, it's going to work. And then I go home and do the opposite some days. And I'm like, I know better, but my condition is I want what I want now, right?
Yeah,
I don't want to wait it out. Well, you magnify that by the human beings we're creating with all of this dopamine and addiction and impulse and immediate gratification, and they can't wait. They're putting the cart before the horse with everything, and they all think they're going to be Instagram stars or they're going to have the next best podcast. I think it's dangerous.
I think it's what do they say? Like in the Christian faith, it's like don't chase false idols or whatever. I mean, I'm not well versed in all the scripture, but yeah. So
So you asked me about attachments earlier.
Right.
So the psychology would say that's attachment.
Okay.
Like attaching to things like your looks, this podcast being good, this book going well, your parenting style. Well, when you attach yourself to things like that strongly, they're all going to fail.
And then you're
terrified and anxious and depressed.
It's going to lay all that on you.
Absolutely. Idolatry is the same thing from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
It's saying I'm getting my worth and value from an external source, mm-hmm. from my ability to do X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. And God says, I love you unconditionally. I think you're worthy and valuable because I created you, and you can do nothing to earn that or lose that. But because you choose to be disobedient, I became man and died on the cross and sacrificed myself so I could atone so you don't have to. So you don't have to do any work. You don't have to do any sacrifices. You don't have to do any idols. You don't have to do anything except believe that I love you, mm-hmm. and we can be in relationship.
Yeah.
But a lot of Christianity has turned into the same thing the Pharisees said, which is, no, don't drink, don't smoke, don't do these things.
Yeah, it becomes something where they just use something to segregate, and it's based upon power and influence.
Yep.
And that's that's what happened with the Catholic Church. I mean, hundreds of years ago.
But Jesus literally came to say, all of that stuff doesn't matter to me.
It's just what we do, man.
It's the relationship,
it's what we
do. which is why we need him.
Yeah.
Like we continue to mess it up. And now again, that doesn't mean that. So it's like, for me, if you believe God loves you, like if I work on myself to go, okay, I'm beating myself up, I have shame, I have doubt, but I know God loves me, then I want to do things that are healthy, right? I'm motivated to go, I have a good relationship with God, he loves me, so I want to be kind to people, I want to be loving, I want to be merciful, I want to do these things. But a lot of times people do those things so God loves them. And that's from their parents.
Yeah. How do you deal with I take religion, and I never talk about it on this podcast because I view everything differently. I respect everyone's religion.
Sure.
And I can see you do too, the way you deliver information. And like, I think at the end of the day, what it boils down to is that if you do good things happen. If you do bad things happen. And there's consequence and there's reward. There's reward in good and there's consequence in bad. And it's where you draw that line at. And, you know, that's how it kind of flows. And that's just kind of my perspective on it. But how do you connect with people who may dismiss you immediately if you come out Bible thumping too hard? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that I try to be out like I am on here.
Well, I respect that, but I would just feel like that some people.
Well, I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it is a problem. I think it's a problem that as soon as someone thinks, okay, this man's Christian, he's a Christian guy, these are his beliefs, that anything he has to say is going to be all about that, and that he don't know what he's talking about. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and
I say be in relationship with me.
Yeah.
I don't worry about people I'm not in relationship with. I worry about the people that I have influence over, and I'm friends with, you know, all kinds of people who are not Christian and who don't follow my faith, and through jiu-jitsu, through work. I mean, I see Buddhist clients, I see all kinds of clients from whatever spectrum of sexuality to individuals. And if we get into a faith conversation, they ask me my opinion, I'll tell them what I just told you. But if somebody doesn't like me because I say God loves you unconditionally and thinks you're worthy and valuable, and right, like
get bigger issues.
Yeah, like, so the only thing about Christianity that's different is that works-based model, right? It's like, the problem is we've seen Christianity be taught as a works-based model for so long, but really a lot of faiths, right? It's do these things, God will be happy with you and you'll be saved. Where Christianity is saying there's nothing you can do to lose God's love. He already did all the things that need to be done, except that. And that's where, for me, when I tie the trauma into it and the psychology into it, all of those things also lead to that same thing of you have to have internal worth and value as a human being that's not reliant on anything external to function and be healthy. And all these things we talked about is, well, I need my dad to be proud of me. I need my mom to be proud of me. I need to do good in my job. I need to look good. And those things fail.
Yeah.
And then you're left with, well, my worth and value is tied into how successful I was at these things. And we teach our kids these things. And that's a huge cycle. So I would say, I love hearing about how other people believe religion things. I love learning about it, read about it. And my question to them is always like, as long as your belief system is congruent with your actions, that's great.
Yeah.
But our biggest problem, all of us, myself included, is we say, I have this belief, but then our behaviors don't match that belief.
They don't reflect well. Yeah, I do think, I think that the Bible is an amazing handbook. I mean, it talks about all different things: war, genocide, end of times, beginning of times, sexuality. I mean, you can go on and on and on. I mean, it's not something that just curated itself out of nowhere. It took input. No, I think reading into every single scripture too deep can create issues. I've seen that.
People do that.
Yeah. But I do respect it as what it is. But there's always so much talk to where something's gone too far one way or too far another. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think when people use the Bible or Christianity or any religion to try to force someone to convert, to beat it over their head, to judge them in a moral way, that for me is not what Jesus did. And so, I just try to be in line with that and love on people and be around people. And it's not my job. I don't think information is transformation. I could tell you all day what the Bible says. I could lecture you about the rules and the law and why. I could tell you all the history. But unless you have a stirring in your heart to change your life, I can't do anything about that. And so I don't get into any of that.
It's like anyone who actually wants to deliver the message has testimony. If you have testimony, you can attach emotion to that and, take that information as you will.
Absolutely. And we all have faith. I mean, This is the reality.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to wake up. We hope we wake up and live tomorrow. That's faith.
Yeah.
However you want to spin it, that is faith.
100%. So people that are arrogant enough to go, oh, religion's terrible, faith is terrible. It's like, well, you put your faith, someone's telling you information about how the world functions, or you think that you know all the things, and either one of those are faith.
Yeah.
So if you're a person that goes, oh, no, I trust myself. I trust my judgment 100%. I know how this world works. It's like, oof. I mean, I don't know anything.
I don't know anything.
At 40, I'm like, I realized how much of an idiot I was at 30, and I hope by 50, I
keep realizing how much of an idiot I was yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, there's always something.
Every couple of years.
Every day, it's like, if you learn something, I'm like, I learned something new today, and I was like, God, man, I wish I would have known that yesterday or last year. You know
100%.
What I mean? What do you think about? We talked about kids a lot. We talked about this religion a little bit. And your perspective on the transformation and everything. What about adults, like people that are currently dealing with issues that may not be tied directly to, you know, sexual things, but more like post-traumatic distress, or I feel like we have so much information on it that there's not a lot of talk about anxiety, because everyone wants to use that as a crutch almost. It seems that way now. And I've even been through it, you know, and didn't realize that's what it was, you know, and then kind of walked myself through it and figured out how to kind of, you know, just deal with it. And it's been over the past few years, and I didn't know what it was. It just because I had a complete life change for the good, not for the bad, but it still gave me anxiety.
Well, we all have anxiety is a cortisol adrenaline issue, right? So if we just kind of go, we're meat machines, let's get the religion out of here.
Yeah.
It's a cortisol adrenaline problem. And it's we should have anxiety. If you're in the woods and there's a grizzly bear and you don't have any anxiety, you're going to die. So there's a inner fear, anxiety, adrenaline survival mechanism that I think is built into us that is good for us. The problem is that when we stay in that state around things that should not be scary and that should not be overwhelming, then we build habits and we build neural pathways that becomes the automatic response, right? Just like working out, just like jiu-jitsu, just like sports. If you practice something over and over and over again, then that's going to be the natural response. So what happens is that we, when we have a traumatic experience or something that's a violation early on, we never deal with it. So imagine you and your best friend are walking down the sidewalk and there's this tall, thick grass, and all of a sudden a lion jumps out of the tall, thick grass and mauls your friend. They die. You go, oh gosh, the cops come. A couple weeks later, you're on like a trip to get away. You've maybe gone and talked to somebody, and you go for a walk and you see this tall, thick grass. What are you going to do?
Avoid it.
Yeah, you're going to freak out. You're going to get heart palpitations. You're going to get anxiety. You're going to probably run the other direction. Did the tall grass kill your friend? No. So now we're terrified of something that isn't the danger.
Right.
That's what anxiety and trauma response is that people are they've never dealt with any of their tigers and their lions in their life. Now there's all this tall grass, and that's the problem.
Do you think that some people, like, I almost am desensitized to some of this stuff because you hear it so much, and then everyone wants to have that, which this is messed up to say, but everyone wants to have that bad thing they dealt with to justify actions.
So there's a difference, right?
Right. That's what I'm getting at.
I think that's the key.
Yeah.
Is personal responsibility. Like, I love Jocko for his stuff. Like, you know,
awesome,
because it's like you have to have this combination of personal responsibility and you know, radical ownership.
Yeah.
Here's the problem. Most people at some point in their childhood were a victim. Something happened. There was exposure. There was a trauma. If we never deal with that and we never honor and work through that, maybe it's an hour, maybe it's 2 hours, maybe it's 5 sessions, then we can't move out of the victim seat. And what we have as a society is people staying in the victim seat, and then, you know, everything's gaslighting, everything's betrayal trauma, everything's anxiety and depression, everything's PTSD.
I grew up this way, so it's justified for me to act this way, or, you know, blah, blah, so on and so forth.
Right. And so we have to learn how to hold two truths at one time. And one of the things I try to work with clients is learning how to hold those two truths at one time. Yes, your dad abused you. Yes, he neglected you. And yes, that was horrible. Also, you would have done the same thing had you been in the same situation, possibly. You have some things in your life that they're a symptom of your problems, and you're saying, well, my dad did this, so that's why I do it, and that excuses it. Well, then why doesn't your dad get that same thing?
Yeah.
His dad beat him, right? And you probably got it. Like, a lot of parents are like, well, you got it less than I did.
Everyone says that.
Right? Well, because that's partly true.
Yeah, it is. I mean,
but it doesn't justify someone abusing you.
Yeah, right.
And that cycle continues.
Yeah.
So how do we stop the cycle? We take radical ownership and we go, okay, my dad did do these things. Now I need to figure out how to deal with how that affected my mind, body, and spirit.
You can't go too far to the other side and completely ignore discipline. Oh, that's where it gets weird, man.
What's the middle ground?
Yeah.
Right? It's going, and how do you find the middle ground? Well, you have people around you, community, who goes, hey, man, where should I feel like this, I'm frustrated with this. And they go, yeah, but that doesn't justify doing that with your son, or that doesn't justify that. Or, hey, dude, like, you know, my best friend would say, you know, there's times where I can see him go from 0 to 10, and I'll go outside and grab him. I'll be, all right, man? He's like, yeah, man. I'm like, okay, you know, that's your dad's stuff, right? And he's like, mm-hmm. And we'll talk through it. And he's like, okay, he'll go back out and talk to his kid, and, you know, he'll calm down. And he does the same thing for me. Well, how can we do that? Well, we've had conversations like this where we know each other well enough to go, I'm not going to allow your trauma and the thing that it did to you to cause you to replicate that.
Yeah.
And I'm also not going to allow for you to pretend like that didn't happen.
And you're also not looking at that person less than because
I'm not judging
because they deal with issues different than you do.
That's literally what grace is.
Yeah.
It's going, you deserve favor. It's undeserved. You know, like you lose your temper. Somebody does drugs. Somebody's tatted up. Somebody, whatever the thing is that people do that people judge people for. It's like, dude, like look in the mirror. All of us have these things and they all come from all this stuff.
Yeah.
We can't justify it, but we can't minimize it either. One of the things that we do to minimize trauma is like when I got back from Afghanistan or deployments or whatever, people would say, hey, I want you to talk about that. And be like, dude, I didn't get deployed like a bunch of times. I didn't kill a bunch of people, you know? And true, I'm nothing compared to a special. My deployments were nothing compared to a lot of guys I know. But my deployments compared to someone who's never been to war,
yeah, there's a huge difference.
right. And that's what we do with a lot of things.
It's just like a reporter being on the front lines and them saying, well, you were just a reporter.
Yeah. But we do the same thing with abuse,
still
right?
dealing with stuff.
We're like, oh, well, my dad never really beat me.
Yeah.
Right. My dad provided stuff for me, or we had a house and a roof. There are people who didn't eat. There are people.
They justify it.
Well, they minimize their trauma.
Yeah.
So because they don't want to make it too big, but what that does is that invalidates their inner child and their neurology. And so then instead of addressing it and moving on, they're constantly searching for that validation without even knowing it. And that's what creates so much of the mess that we're in. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm right there. We're gonna wrap this thing up in just a second,
good.
but yeah, we're gonna have to do this again because I need more time. All right, man. So you got this book coming out. Where can we get it? You know, when's it coming out? And then also give me your plugs and your social media and all that.
Yeah, so I'd say first people go look at the TED Talk on YouTube. So it's just type in Clint Davis TED Talk and it'll be the first thing to come up and you can kind of see what this book is about or the core of it. But you can find it on Amazon.com right now or BarnesandNoble.com. You can pre-order it. There's softcover, hardcover. The audiobook and the ebook will come out in the next couple months before it comes out November 6th officially. It's called Building Better Bridges, a guidebook to having difficult conversations that can save your kids. And then our ats are at Clint Davis Counseling on Facebook, on Instagram. So really, you know, that's what I'd love people to go follow. We also have a podcast called Asking Why with Clint Davis. It's on iTunes, and we talk a lot about these things. I have guests come in and talk about mental health and trauma and addiction and parenting and raising kids and all the things. So those would be all the things that they can look at, and they can visit us at clintdaviscounseling.com. And if they want to book a speaker, you know, if somebody listen to this that wants me to come to their kid's school or come to their church or their synagogue or their mosque or whatever, I'm doing a lot of those talks right now on just helping parents, you know, navigate keeping kids safe online and in person.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks for your time today, dude. We opened a lot of doors, and
Yeah.
we're gonna have to do this again because there's so much more I want to talk about. So I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, dude. Appreciate you.
All right.